Montana Territory, 1873. The whisper of wind through prairie grass couldn't mask the sound of quiet sobbing that caught Owen Vance's attention as he crested the small hill overlooking Promise Creek. He reined in his chestnut gelding, squinting against the late afternoon sun. There, among the scattered wooden markers of the settlement's small cemetery, knelt a young woman bent over a fresh grave, one with no marker at all. Owen was 25, trail-weary from 2 months driving cattle, and had learned long ago that the Montana frontier was no place for sentiment. Heartache was as common as dust in these parts. You learned to keep moving, or it buried you alongside all the other fools who'd come west with dreams bigger than their abilities. He'd buried enough friends and fellow drovers to know that attachment only led to pain when nature, disease, or a bullet inevitably took them away. He should ride on. The town of Promise Creek was just a mile ahead, and after weeks on the trail, a hot meal and whiskey called his name more persuasively than some stranger's grief. Yet something in the woman's solitude held him still. "Come on, Rusty," he murmured, turning his horse down the slope toward the cemetery. The woman didn't hear his approach over her crying. She wore a simple blue calico dress, dusty at the hem, her honey blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders. A small bouquet of wildflowers lay on the freshly turned earth before her. "Pardon me, miss," Owen said softly, remaining mounted to avoid frightening her. "Are you all right?" She startled, rising quickly and wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Now facing him, Owen could see she was young, perhaps 20, with eyes the color of the sky after rain and tear-stained cheeks that flushed with embarrassment. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she said, trying to compose herself though her voice wavered. "Just saying goodbye." Owen nodded toward the unmarked grave. "No stone yet." "There won't be one," she replied, a flash of something, anger perhaps or determination, crossing her face. "Nobody here knows who he was, just another drifter who died of fever at the doctor's office. They wouldn't even put his name on a marker." "Did you know him?" Owen asked, curious now. She shook her head. "No, I heard he had no family, no one to mourn him." It didn't seem right. Owen studied her, puzzled by such sentiment for a stranger. In his 8 years riding the trails since leaving home at 17, he'd seen countless men die unmourned and unremembered. It was the way of the frontier, harsh, unsentimental, final. "That's mighty charitable of you, miss." "Jessamine Frost," she offered. "Most folks call me Jess." "Owen Vance," he replied with a tip of his hat. "Just delivered a herd to the Thornton Ranch." Something in her gaze softened. "You must be tired then, the trail from Wyoming is long." "Kansas actually, but yes, long enough." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the soft nickering of Owen's horse. "Well," Jess said finally, gathering a small basket at her feet, "I should be getting back. My aunt will be wondering where I've gone off to." Owen hesitated, then gestured toward town. "Mind if I ride alongside you? These parts can be rough for a lady alone." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Promise Creek isn't so dangerous, Mr. Vance, but I wouldn't mind the company." As they walked toward town, Owen leading his horse, he found himself studying Jessamine Frost more carefully. There was a quietness to her that seemed at odds with her apparent compassion for strangers. Most young women he'd encountered in frontier towns were either hardened by circumstance or still clinging to Eastern sensibilities, but Jess seemed neither. "You live in Promise Creek long?" he asked. "2 years now. I came west with my aunt after my parents died back in Ohio. Aunt Martha runs the mercantile." "Frost's Goods." Owen recalled seeing the storefront on previous passes through town. Jess nodded. "That's the one, and are you just passing through?" "Always am," Owen replied with the easy certainty of a man who knew his place in the world. "Staying long enough to rest the horses and maybe take on another job. The trail's my home." "No family waiting somewhere?" she asked. "None that would recognize me now," he said, keeping his tone light. "The saddle's been my home since I was younger than you." They reached the edge of town, where the neat, whitewashed church gave way to more practical structures, the livery, a blacksmith shop, and beyond them, the main street with its false-fronted businesses. Promise Creek wasn't large, but it had grown since Owen had last passed through a year earlier. The railroad 60 miles south was bringing more settlers, more commerce. Aunt Martha will have fresh bread today if you're looking for a meal better than trail fare, Jess offered as they neared the mercantile. She bakes on Thursdays. Owen found himself strangely reluctant to end their conversation. Might take you up on that offer, Miss Frost. It's just Jess, she corrected him gently. Then, with a directness that surprised him, she added, Why did you stop, Mr. Vance, at the cemetery, I mean? The question caught him off guard. Most would just ride past a crying woman, she continued, especially a stranger. Owen considered his answer carefully. Don't rightly know, he admitted finally, just seemed like maybe you shouldn't be alone out there. Something in her expression shifted, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Well, I'm grateful you did. Good day, Mr. Vance. Owen, he called after her as she turned toward the mercantile's side door. My name's Owen. She glanced back, a ghost of a smile crossing her face. Good day, Owen. He watched her disappear inside, then led Rusty toward the livery, unsettled in a way he couldn't quite name. 8 years of drifting had taught him the wisdom of keeping relationships as transient as his lifestyle. Cowpunchers who got attached to places, to people, were the ones who made mistakes, the ones who ended up with unmarked graves. Yet something about Jessamine Frost's kindness toward a nameless drifter had struck a chord he'd thought long silenced. As he arranged boarding for his horse, Owen told himself his interest was merely curiosity. By this time tomorrow he'd be back on the trail, Promise Creek nothing but another dusty memory. Jessamine entered the mercantile through the back door that connected to the living quarters she shared with her aunt. The scent of fresh bread still hung in the air, but the kitchen was empty. Aunt Martha would be minding the store. She quickly washed her face in the basin, hoping to erase the evidence of tears before her aunt noticed. Martha Frost was a practical woman who had little patience for what she called excessive sentiment. She would never understand why Jess had felt compelled to visit the grave of a man she'd never met. But Jess couldn't forget the sight of the man's body being carried to the cemetery yesterday, not a single mourner following. Dr. Westfield had said he'd ridden into town already sick with fever, delirious and unable to say more than his first name, Thomas. He'd lasted only 2 days, dying alone in the back room of the doctor's office. It had struck too close to how her own parents had died, her father first from pneumonia, then her mother just weeks later from the same illness. Jess had been the only one to mourn them in their small Ohio town until Aunt Martha had arrived to collect her 18-year-old niece. Taking a deep breath, Jess pinned her hair back neatly and entered the store through the connecting door. Martha Frost, a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a severe bun, was wrapping parcels for Mrs. Perkins, the minister's wife. There you are, Jessamine, Aunt Martha said, her tone revealing nothing to their customer but speaking volumes to Jess. Would you mind helping Mrs. Perkins with these packages? Of course, Jess replied, moving to gather the wrapped goods. Once Mrs. Perkins had departed, Martha turned to her niece with raised eyebrows. You went to that cemetery again, didn't you? Jess busied herself straightening a display of canned goods. Someone had to say a proper goodbye. That man was nothing to you, Martha said with the blunt practicality that defined her. People die out here every day, Jessamine, you can't mourn them all. I know, Jess said quietly. But I keep thinking, what if it had been Papa, or someone else who mattered? Wouldn't we want someone to care? Martha's expression softened slightly. Your tender heart does you credit, child, but life on the frontier requires a certain hardness. You've been here 2 years now, I'd have thought you'd learned that. Jess had learned it in theory. She'd seen the casual brutality of frontier life, the sickness, the accidents, the violence that occasionally erupted in the saloon at the far end of town. But something in her refused to accept that such hardness was necessary or that compassion was a weakness rather than a strength. The bell over the door jangled, and both women looked up to see Owen Vance entering the store. He'd clearly stopped at the barber's first. His face was freshly shaved, his dark hair damp and combed back from his forehead. Without trail dust covering him, Jess could see he was more handsome than she'd first realized, with clear gray eyes and features that might have been carved from granite. Ladies, he greeted them, removing his hat. I heard there might be fresh bread to be had. Martha appraised him with the shrewd eye of a businesswoman accustomed to judging men's characters and creditworthiness at a glance. You'd be one of the drovers who brought in the Thornton herd. Yes, ma'am, Owen Vance, trail boss. Something in Martha's posture eased. The Thorntons were respectable ranchers who paid their debts and employed men of good character. We've got bread and stew if you're hungry for a hot meal. Jessamine, why don't you fix Mr. Vance a plate? It wasn't a request, and Jess led Owen through to the small dining area adjacent to their living quarters. The Frosts served meals to travelers occasionally, though it wasn't their primary business. Your aunt seems formidable, Owen commented as Jess ladled beef stew into a bowl. She had to be, Jess replied, setting the food before him along with thick slices of bread. She's run this place alone since my uncle died 5 years ago. Owen studied her as she moved about the small kitchen. And you, do you like it here in Promise Creek? Jess considered the question seriously. It's home now, she said finally. I miss trees sometimes. Ohio had such forests, but there's a beauty to the prairie too once you learn to see it. That there is, Owen agreed, surprising her. Most men of his profession complained about the emptiness, the exposure of the plains, though I admit I'm partial to mountains myself. Have you seen many mountains, I mean? As Owen ate, he told her about the ranges he'd crossed, the Rockies, the Tetons, the Blue Mountains of Oregon. Jess found herself captivated not just by the tales, but by the quiet appreciation in his voice when he described the landscapes. It was rare to find a man on the frontier who noticed beauty rather than just danger or opportunity. You've seen so much, she said when he finished his meal, I can hardly imagine it. Seeing's not the same as belonging, Owen replied, his voice suddenly distant. Pretty country's still just country when you're passing through. There was a loneliness in his words that resonated with something in Jess. For all that Promise Creek was home now, she sometimes felt as though she were just passing through herself, present in body but not quite rooted in spirit. The bell from the store jangled insistently, and Jess realized her aunt needed help. Excuse me, she said, rising quickly. Of course, Owen nodded, standing as she did. Thank you for the meal, Miss Frost, best I've had in months. When she returned 10 minutes later after helping a rancher's wife with a large order, Owen was gone. In his place was payment for the meal and a small wildflower, similar to those she'd placed on the nameless grave, laid carefully beside his empty plate. Jess found herself smiling as she picked it up, then quickly set it aside when she heard her aunt approaching. Martha would certainly have opinions about cowboys leaving flowers, and Jess wasn't prepared to hear them. Owen spent the night at the Promise Creek Hotel, a grand name for a modest 2-story building with 8 rental rooms above the town's respectable saloon. He'd intended to inquire about work opportunities the following morning, then move on as he always did. Yet as he sipped his morning coffee in the hotel's small dining room, his thoughts kept returning to Jessamine Frost. There was something compelling about her, not just her beauty, though she was certainly beautiful, but the contradiction she embodied. Tender-hearted enough to mourn a stranger, yet resilient enough to build a life in this unforgiving territory. Most women out here were either hardened beyond their years or desperately clinging to Eastern refinements that had no place on the frontier. Jess seemed to have found a different path. Mr. Vance, a deep voice interrupted his thoughts. Owen looked up to find Gerald Thornton, owner of the ranch where he delivered cattle the day before, standing beside his table. Mr. Thornton, Owen acknowledged, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Something wrong with the herd? No, no, Thornton said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair. Finest cattle I've seen delivered this year, that's partly why I'm here. The rancher ordered coffee from the passing waitress before continuing. My foreman tells me you're one of the best trail bosses in the business. Says you can read weather, Indians, and cattle better than most men twice your age. Owen shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. Just experience, sir. I've been driving herds since I was 17. And you're what now, 25, 26? 25 come August. Thornton nodded appreciatively. What I need is a man who can handle responsibility. I'm expanding my operation, bought the old Carson place north of town. Need someone to manage it while I focus on the main ranch. Owen stared at him, taken aback. You're offering me a permanent position. Ranch manager at the North property, Good pay, your own cabin, and a stake in the herd increase after the first year. You'd still get plenty of trail time. I'll need someone to take cattle to market, procure new stock. It was a generous offer, the kind most cowboys would leap at. A chance for stability, advancement, perhaps eventually a spread of one's own. Yet Owen's first instinct was to refuse. 8 years of constant movement had ingrained in him the belief that permanence was just another word for vulnerability. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thornton, but I've always been a drifter, not sure I'd take well to putting down roots. Thornton sipped his coffee, studying Owen over the rim of his cup. Roots don't have to cage a man, Vance. They can anchor him, give him something worth coming back to. He stood, placing a few coins on the table for his coffee. Think it over, I'm not leaving until tomorrow afternoon. After Thornton departed, Owen sat nursing his cooling coffee, uncharacteristically indecisive. The smart move would be to decline and move on, yet something kept him from dismissing the offer outright. He decided a ride might clear his head. After retrieving Rusty from the livery, he found himself automatically turning toward the cemetery on the hill outside town. He told himself he just wanted to enjoy the morning view, but the truth lodged stubbornly in his mind. He was hoping to encounter Jessamine Frost again. The cemetery was empty this morning, the nameless grave now adorned with a simple wooden cross. Someone, Jess, he assumed, had carved a single word into it, Thomas. It wasn't a proper marker, but it was more than most drifters received. Owen removed his hat, standing awkwardly before the grave. He wasn't a religious man, but something about Jess's compassion for this unknown drifter had stirred memories of his own nearly forgotten past. Of the mother who'd read him Bible stories before consumption took her when he was 10. Of the father who'd followed her 2 bitter years later, leaving young Owen to the reluctant care of an uncle who'd made it clear the boy was nothing but a burden. Reckon she was right to give you a name at least, Owen said aloud to the silent grave. Man ought to have that much. I thought the same thing. Owen turned to find Jess standing a few yards away, a fresh bouquet of wildflowers in hand. Today she wore a simple yellow dress that caught the morning sunlight, her honey-blonde hair braided and pinned up beneath a practical bonnet. She looked like summer personified. Miss Frost, he greeted her, suddenly self-conscious to be caught talking to a grave. I was just paying respects, she finished for him, approaching to stand beside him. I'm glad I'm not the only one who thought he deserved that much. Did you make this? Owen gestured to the cross. Jess nodded. Last night, the undertaker said no one would mind if I put it up since there's no family to object. She laid her flowers at the base of the cross. It's not much, but at least he's not just nothing. It's more than most. Get out here, Owen said quietly. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Jess spoke again. Will you be leaving today? Most drovers don't stay long in Promise Creek. I'm considering an offer, actually. Thornton wants me to manage his new property north of town. Jess looked genuinely pleased. That's wonderful. The Carson place is beautiful right along Promise Creek with the foothills behind it. You know it. I ride out that way sometimes, she admitted. When Aunt Martha doesn't need me in the store, there's a stand of cottonwoods by the creek that reminds me a little of Ohio. Owen tried to picture Jess riding alone through the countryside and found the image both appealing and concerning. Isn't that risky, a lady riding alone? A flash of independence sparked in her eyes. Promise Creek is relatively safe these days, and I'm a good rider. Besides, one can't live in fear forever. The word struck Owen with unexpected force. Wasn't that exactly what he'd been doing, living as though permanence inevitably led to loss, as though any attachment would inevitably be severed? No, he said slowly, I suppose one can't. They walked back toward town together, their conversation turning to lighter matters. The spring weather, the town's plans for an Independence Day celebration, the new schoolteacher who had arrived by stagecoach the previous week. Owen found himself laughing more than he had in months. At the edge of town they paused, both suddenly aware that their paths would diverge. Will you take it? Jess asked. The position with Mr. Thornton. Owen hesitated. I haven't decided. The trail's been my home a long time. Jess studied him with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. Home isn't always where we've been the longest, she said softly. Sometimes it's where we find peace. Before he could respond, she continued, Aunt Martha and I are having a few friends for dinner tonight. Nothing formal, just neighbors. You'd be welcome to join us if you're still in town. The invitation surprised him. I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition, she assured him. 6 o'clock if you'd like to come. As he watched her walk away, Owen felt something shifting inside him, like ground that had been frozen for years suddenly warming under spring sunshine. He'd spent 8 years convincing himself that the only safe path was one that never intersected too long with others, that connections were dangerous liabilities on the frontier. Yet in just 24 hours, Promise Creek and Jessamine Frost in particular had begun to challenge that belief in ways he couldn't easily dismiss. Jess spent the afternoon helping her aunt prepare for their dinner guests while trying not to think too much about whether Owen Vance would accept her invitation. Martha had raised an eyebrow when Jess mentioned inviting him but had simply said, I suppose we can set another place. By 5:30, the Frosts' modest home behind the Mercantile smelled of roast beef and apple pie. Their other guests began arriving, Dr. Westfield and his wife, the new schoolteacher Miss Hammond, and Reverend Perkins and his wife, all regular dinner companions who comprised what passed for society in Promise Creek. At 10 minutes past 6, Jess had resigned herself to Owen's absence when a knock at the door announced his arrival. He stood on the threshold looking uncharacteristically formal in a clean white shirt and dark vest, his hat in his hands and his dark hair still damp from washing. I hope I'm not too late, he said, a hesitant smile crossing his features. Took longer at the barber's than I expected. Not at all, Jess assured him, warmth flooding through her. Please come in. Dinner was a lively affair. Owen proved surprisingly adept at conversation, sharing stories of cattle drives and frontier towns that entertained without straying into impropriety. He listened attentively to the schoolteacher's plans for expanding the town's small school and discussed cattle breeding with Dr. Westfield, who supplemented his medical practice by raising Herefords on a small ranch outside town. Mr. Vance, Mrs. Perkins said toward the end of the meal, Jessamine tells us Mr. Thornton has offered you a position managing his new property. Do you intend to accept? All eyes turned to Owen, who glanced briefly at Jess before answering, I'm still considering it, ma'am. It would be a change from the trail life I'm accustomed to. A positive one, I should think, Martha interjected. Driving cattle is young man's work, dangerous and uncertain. A management position offers security. There's value in putting down roots, Reverend Perkins agreed. A man needs community, especially out here where life is hard. We all depend on one another in ways folks back east can scarcely imagine. Owen nodded politely, but Jess could see the conflicted emotions behind his composed expression. She understood his hesitation better than the others. The frontier demanded self-sufficiency, yet it also punished isolation. It was a paradox that many never resolved. After dinner, while the others gathered in the small parlor for coffee, Jess found Owen examining the bookshelf in the corner, a prized possession that Martha had insisted on bringing all the way from Ohio. You like to read? Jess asked, joining him. When I can, he replied, running his fingers along the spine of a volume of Tennyson. Books are heavy to carry in a bedroll, though. I usually trade them at each town I pass through. You're welcome to borrow any of these, Jess offered. If you stay, I mean. Owen turned to face her, his expression serious. Why did you invite me tonight, Jess? The directness of his question caught her off guard. I thought you might enjoy the company, and, she hesitated, then decided on honesty, I enjoyed talking with you. It's not often I meet someone who understands both worlds, the East and the frontier. Is that how you see yourself, caught between worlds? Jess considered the question carefully. Perhaps. I've accepted the West as my home, but I haven't forgotten what came before. I think that's why I couldn't bear the thought of that man, Thomas, being buried without even his name acknowledged. Everyone deserves to be remembered. Owen's gaze softened. My mother used to say something similar. She kept a book where she wrote down the name of every person in our town who passed. Said somebody ought to remember them properly. It was the first time he'd mentioned his family, and Jess sensed the significance of the disclosure. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, Owen agreed, a shadow crossing his face. Consumption took her when I was 10, my father followed 2 years later. I'm sorry, Jess said softly. My parents died of pneumonia just before I came west. It's a terrible thing losing family. Something passed between them then, a recognition, a shared understanding that went deeper than words. For a moment, they were not just a cowboy and a shopkeeper's niece, but two people who understood loss, who had rebuilt lives from its ashes. The moment was broken by Martha calling for Jess to help serve coffee. The evening concluded shortly after, with the guests departing into the cool spring night. Owen was the last to leave, pausing at the door to thank Martha for her hospitality. Will we see you again, Mr. Vance? Martha asked, her tone neutral but her gaze assessing. Or will you be moving on? Owen glanced at Jess, something unreadable in his expression. I believe I'll be staying in Promise Creek a while longer, ma'am. Good night, ladies. After he left, Martha turned to her niece with raised eyebrows. That young man has his eye on you, Jessamine. Jess felt heat rise to her cheeks. We've only just met, Aunt Martha. 2 days is more than enough time to recognize quality when you see it, her aunt replied pragmatically. And he seems a decent sort for a cowboy. If he does take that position with Thornton, he might make something of himself. I hardly think. Of course you don't, Martha interrupted, her tone softening. You're young yet. But a woman alone on the frontier needs to think practically about these matters. Good men are scarce out here. As Jess prepared for bed that night, her aunt's words echoed in her mind. She'd come west with no intention of marrying, content to help her aunt and perhaps eventually teach in the town's school. Yet there was something about Owen Vance that had stirred feelings she'd thought safely dormant, not just attraction, though he was certainly handsome, but a sense of recognition. As though in him she'd found someone who understood the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people yet still feeling somehow apart. She fell asleep thinking of gray eyes and the soft prairie wind, uncertain what tomorrow might bring but, for the first time in months, eager to find out. Owen spent a restless night at the hotel, Thornton's offer weighing on his mind. By dawn, he'd made his decision. He rode out to the Thornton ranch early, finding the owner already at work in his office. I'd like to accept your offer, Owen said without preamble, if it's still open. Thornton grinned, rising to shake Owen's hand. Glad to hear it, son. I had a feeling you might come around. What changed your mind, if you don't mind my asking? Owen hesitated, unwilling to admit that a pair of blue eyes and a compassionate heart had influenced him more than practical considerations. Thought it might be time to try something more permanent, he said instead. A man can't live on the trail forever. Wise decision, Thornton nodded. The Carson place needs work, but it has good bones. Previous owner let it go to seed after his wife died, but the land's prime and the water rights are solid. I can have you moved in by the end of the week. They spent the next few hours discussing specifics: salary, responsibilities, the condition of the existing structures, plans for expanding the small herd currently grazing the property. By the time Owen rode back to town, it was nearly noon, and he felt a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. For the first time since he was 17, he had committed to staying in one place. His first instinct was to find Jess and tell her, but he hesitated outside the mercantile. Their acquaintance was just 3 days old, hardly a foundation for the feelings already taking root in his heart. Better to give it time to establish himself at the Carson place before presuming too much on her friendliness. Instead, he spent the afternoon making preparations, purchasing supplies, arranging to have his few possessions from the trail moved to the property, discussing improvements with the town's carpenter. By evening, he was tired but satisfied with his progress. Tomorrow, he would ride out to the Carson place, his new home, and begin the work of transformation. As he walked back to the hotel, he passed the cemetery on the hill. On impulse, he turned up the path, wanting one more look at the grave that had, improbably, changed the course of his life. The setting sun cast long shadows across the burial ground, gilding the simple wooden cross that marked Thomas's resting place. To Owen's surprise, Jess was there again, kneeling beside the grave, her hands busy with some task he couldn't discern. "We meet again," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, a smile warming her features. "Owen. I was just planting some wildflowers. The ground is finally soft enough." He knelt beside her, watching as she gently pressed the roots of prairie flowers into the soil. "You're determined he won't be forgotten." "Everyone deserves that much dignity," she replied simply. When she finished, they walked to the edge of the cemetery in companionable silence, pausing to look out over the town as the last light faded from the sky. "I accepted Thornton's offer," Owen said finally. "I'm riding out to the Carson place tomorrow to get started." The pleasure that lit her face warmed something in his chest. "That's wonderful news," she said. "The Carson place is lovely, or it was before Mr. Carson let it go to ruin after his wife passed, but the bones are good, as my aunt would say." "That's what Thornton said too," Owen smiled. "I'd welcome your opinion sometime. If you're ever riding out that way, I mean." "I'd like that," Jess said softly. The air between them seemed to still, charged with possibility. Owen found himself wanting to reach for her hand to draw her closer in the gathering darkness. Instead, he cleared his throat. "May I walk you home? It's getting dark." "Thank you," she nodded, and they descended the hill side by side. At the door to the mercantile, Jess paused. "I'm glad you're staying, Owen," she said simply. "So am I," he replied, surprised to find how completely he meant it. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity for both of them. Owen threw himself into restoring the Carson place, repairing fences, cleaning out the small but sturdy cabin, and assessing the condition of the outbuildings. Thornton provided men and materials for the larger projects, but much of the detail work fell to Owen alone. Jess continued helping her aunt in the store while watching for any opportunity to ride out toward the foothills where the Carson property nestled alongside Promise Creek. 2 weeks after Owen had taken the position, such an opportunity presented itself when a customer needed medicine delivered to a ranch in the same direction. The late May morning was perfect for riding, clear skies, mild temperatures, and wildflowers painting the prairie in swathes of color. After completing her delivery, Jess allowed her mare to amble toward the Carson place, telling herself she was merely curious about the property's transformation. As she crested the final rise, the ranch came into view below. Even from a distance, she could see the improvements. The cabin's roof had been repaired, the yard cleared of debris, and new fencing enclosed a corral where several horses grazed. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could make out Owen's tall figure splitting wood near the barn. She hesitated, suddenly unsure of her welcome. They had seen each other only briefly in town over the past weeks, exchanging pleasant but hurried greetings as their paths crossed. Was it too forward to call on him unannounced? Before she could decide, Owen looked up, shading his eyes against the sun. He raised a hand in greeting, and Jess found herself urging her horse down the slope toward him. "Miss Frost," he called as she approached, setting aside his axe. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "I was delivering medicine to the Hoffman Ranch," she explained, accepting his help to dismount. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Not at all," Owen assured her, his smile warming his features. "I'd welcome a break in some company. Would you like to see what I've accomplished so far?" Jess nodded eagerly, and Owen led her on a tour of the property. The cabin, though small, had been thoroughly cleaned and repaired, its interior simple but comfortable with a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow bed in the corner. The barn had been cleared of years of debris, and fresh hay filled the stalls. "Mr. Thornton sent over 20 head of cattle yesterday," Owen explained as they walked toward a fenced pasture. "It's a start. I'll be driving another 50 up from his main ranch next week." "You've done so much in such a short time," Jess marveled. "It's already looking like a proper ranch again." Owen's expression grew serious. "I want to do it right, make something lasting." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate context. Jess found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw now sporting several days' growth of beard, the clear gray eyes that reflected the sky, the lines at their corners that spoke of years squinting against prairie sun and wind. "I think you will," she said softly. They reached a stand of cottonwoods along the creek that gave the town its name. Their fresh spring leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, creating dappled shade on the grassy bank. "Is this the spot you mentioned?" Owen asked. "The one that reminds you of Ohio?" Jess nodded, surprised he had remembered. "Yes, in spring with the new leaves I can almost imagine I'm back in my father's orchard." "Do you miss it?" "Ohio, I mean." Sometimes, she admitted, not the place so much as the feeling of belonging there gave me, of knowing exactly where and how I fit. Owen nodded in understanding. I haven't felt that since I was a boy. Maybe never, really. The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep in Jess's heart. Perhaps you can find it here, she suggested. Perhaps, he agreed, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than casual acquaintance warranted. They walked back to the cabin where Owen insisted on making coffee. As they sat at his small table, conversation flowed easily between them about books they had read, places they had seen, hopes for the future of Promise Creek. Jess found herself laughing at Owen's dry observations about frontier life and the characters he had encountered in his years on the trail. I should be getting back, she said finally, noticing the sun's position. Aunt Martha will be wondering where I've disappeared to. As Owen helped her mount her horse, their hands touched briefly, sending a current of awareness through Jess that left her momentarily breathless. Perhaps you could ride out again sometime, Owen suggested, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty she found endearing in such a self-sufficient man. The wildflowers along the creek will be at their peak next week. I'd like that, Jess replied, gathering her reins. Good luck with the cattle drive. As she rode away, Jess found herself smiling. There was something about Owen Vance that made her feel both completely at ease and exhilaratingly alive, a combination she had never experienced before. Over the next month, their friendship deepened through a series of chance meetings that both recognized were anything but accidental. Owen found reasons to visit town more frequently than his work required, timing his arrivals at the mercantile to coincide with the quieter afternoon hours when Jess might have time for conversation. Jess discovered a previously unrecognized interest in riding in the direction of the Carson place, sometimes bringing baskets of food that she claimed her aunt had insisted she deliver. By mid-June, the entire town had noticed their growing attachment. Martha Frost observed her niece's increasing happiness with cautious approval, while town gossips speculated on when the handsome young rancher might make his intentions formal. For Owen, these weeks brought a revelation. The permanence he had feared for so long now felt like freedom rather than constraint. Each improvement to the ranch, each new routine established, each root sunk deeper into Promise Creek's soil made him feel not trapped but increasingly secure. And at the center of this transformation was Jessamine Frost, whose gentle strength and compassionate heart had shown him possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. On the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, Owen invited Jess to ride out to a special spot he had discovered in the foothills beyond his property. They packed a picnic and set out early, the morning cool and bright with promise. Where exactly are we going? Jess asked as they rode side by side, the Carson ranch receding behind them. There's a view I want to show you, Owen replied, just over that ridge. I found it last week while tracking a stray calf. They climbed steadily, the horses picking their way carefully over the increasingly rocky terrain. When they reached the crest of the ridge, Owen dismounted and helped Jess down from her mare. Close your eyes, he instructed, taking her hand. Jess complied, allowing him to guide her forward several paces. The sun warmed her face and a breeze carried the scent of pine and sage. All right, Owen said, his voice close to her ear. Look now. Jess opened her eyes and gasped. Before them spread a panoramic view of the entire valley, Promise Creek nestled in the distance, the ribbon of the creek winding through green pastures, the Carson ranch clearly visible below, and beyond it all, the vast prairie stretching to the horizon. Owen, it's beautiful, she breathed, unconsciously tightening her grip on his hand. I thought you might appreciate it, he said, watching her face rather than the view. It helps me remember why I stayed. The simple statement drew Jess's gaze from the landscape to his face. The look in his eyes made her heart quicken. And why did you stay? She asked softly. Instead of answering with words, Owen reached up to cup her cheek gently in his calloused palm. He gave her time to pull away, but Jess stood perfectly still, her eyes never leaving his. When his lips met hers, the tentative kiss felt like both a question and an answer. Jess responded with a sureness that belied her inexperience, her hands coming to rest against his chest as the kiss deepened into something that expressed all they had yet to say aloud. When they finally parted, Owen rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, he admitted. I'm glad you finally did, Jess replied, a smile curving her lips. They spread their picnic blanket in the shade of a lone pine tree and spent the afternoon talking, sharing stories of their lives before Promise Creek that they had previously kept private. Owen told her of his years on the trail, of the loneliness he had never acknowledged even to himself, of the emptiness that had driven him ever onward. Jess spoke of her parents' deaths, of the grief that sometimes still caught her unawares, of her struggle to find purpose in her new Western life. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley, Owen reached for Jess's hand. "I need to tell you something," he said, his expression serious. "When I first saw you at that nameless grave, I thought you were being sentimental over nothing. A drifter dying alone, that's just the way of things out here." Jess started to respond, but Owen continued, "But I was wrong. Your compassion for a stranger made me see how cold I'd become. How I'd convinced myself that caring was dangerous, that connections were liabilities. You showed me another way." "Owen, please let me finish," he said gently. "I've spent 8 years believing the only safe path was one I walked alone. But these past weeks have taught me that safety isn't the absence of risk, it's having something so precious that any risk is worth taking." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Jessamine Frost. I think I started falling in love with you that first day at the cemetery." Jess felt tears welling in her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I wasn't looking for love when I came west, but I found it in you." Their kiss this time was deeper, a promise sealed between them as the sun gilded the valley in gold and crimson. On Independence Day, Promise Creek held its annual celebration in the town square. Bunting decorated the storefronts, tables groaned with food contributed by the townsfolk, and a small band of local musicians provided music for dancing. Owen and Jess arrived together, their courtship now official and blessed by Martha's approval. They had spent the intervening weeks in a state of joyful discovery, finding in each other the understanding and companionship both had secretly longed for. As twilight fell and lanterns illuminated the square, Owen led Jess away from the festivities toward the church, which stood dark and quiet at the edge of town. "Where are we going?" Jess asked, curious but trusting. "There's something I want to show you," Owen replied, guiding her around the side of the church toward the cemetery beyond. In the gathering darkness, Jess could just make out the shape of the nameless drifter's grave, except it was no longer unmarked. In place of the simple wooden cross stood a proper headstone of polished granite. "Owen," Jess gasped, stepping closer to read the inscription in the fading light, "Thomas. Unknown in life, remembered in death. For God so loved the world." 1873. "You did this," Jess whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Owen nodded, his expression tender. "I ordered it from Denver the day after I accepted Thornton's offer. It arrived yesterday." He took her hands in his. "You were right, Jess. Everyone deserves to be remembered." Overcome with emotion, Jess could only press herself against his chest, her arms encircling his waist as his enfolded her. "There's something else," Owen said after a moment, gently disengaging to reach into his pocket. He withdrew a small velvet box and sank to one knee before her. The world seemed to still around them as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small sapphire. "Jessamine Frost, your compassion healed something in me I didn't even know was broken. Your strength reminds me daily that vulnerability isn't weakness. Your love has given me a home I never thought I'd find." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Will you marry me? Make the Carson place our home together." "Yes," Jess whispered through her tears. "Yes, with all my heart." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, the first of the Independence Day fireworks exploded in the sky above, bathing them in momentary brilliance before fading to darkness. But unlike the fleeting lights above, the joy illuminating their hearts would endure, a steady flame to guide them through whatever the frontier might bring. They were married in September, when the cottonwoods along Promise Creek had turned golden and the air carried the first hint of autumn crispness. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the whitewashed church with Reverend Perkins officiating. Jess wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and brought west in Martha's trunk, while Owen cut a handsome figure in a new suit ordered from Denver. After the ceremony, the celebration continued at the Carson Ranch, now officially the Vance Ranch, with tables set beneath the cottonwoods and lanterns strung among the branches. As sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Owen led his bride in their first dance as husband and wife, their happiness mirrored in the faces of those who had come to care for them both. Martha Frost watched her niece with satisfaction, pleased to see the girl who had arrived in Promise Creek broken by grief now radiant with joy. Gerald Thornton raised a glass to his ranch manager, proud to have recognized the potential in the young cowboy that others might have overlooked. As darkness fell and the stars appeared overhead, Owen and Jess slipped away from the celebration to stand together on the porch of their cabin. The small structure Owen had transformed into a cozy home, with bookshelves he had built himself and curtains Jess had sewn hanging at the windows. "Happy, Mrs. Vance?" Owen asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," Jess replied, leaning her head against his shoulder, "though I still can't quite believe how much has changed in just a few months." Owen's thoughts turned to the grave that had brought them together, a nameless drifter whose lonely death had catalyzed the greatest happiness of his life. "Life takes strange turns," he mused, "if you hadn't been at that cemetery that day." "Or if you hadn't stopped," Jess added, "then I'd still be drifting," Owen said simply, believing that roots were just another word for chains. Jess turned in his arms to face him, her blue eyes luminous in the moonlight. "And now?" "Now I know better," he murmured, drawing her closer. "Roots aren't chains at all. They're what allow us to weather any storm." As their lips met in a kiss that sealed their new understanding, both silently offered thanks for the unexpected path that had led them to each other, and to the home neither had expected to find on the Montana frontier. In the years that followed, the Vance Ranch prospered under Owen's capable management. Children came, first a son with his father's gray eyes, then twin daughters with their mother's honey-blonde hair. The small cabin gave way to a proper house, and the herd grew until Owen was able to buy the property outright from Thornton. And each year, on the anniversary of their first meeting, Owen and Jess would visit the cemetery on the hill, placing flowers on the grave of the unknown man called Thomas. They would stand together in silence, remembering how a moment of compassion for a stranger had changed the course of two lives and created a love strong enough to tame the wild frontier.